Before we begin, I was going to ask, just because there's a lot to cover today, and there may not be a ton of time, the same way there has been up till now, to do questions in medias res. Thought I'd ask just now while we wait if you have any questions that I could maybe address now.
I assume that you probably do not believe that determinism and free will is possible at the same time, like Kant sort of.
Right,
but
yeah.
Those your professors who were the main Kantian scholars, so do those people believe that determinism and free will is possible at the same time?
Well, some of them might be. So, there's two questions. One question is, are they compatibilist? Do they think freedom and determinism are compatible? And then the other question is, do they think, and question two, part one, do they think Kant is a compatibilist? No, they know he's an incompatibilist. Two, do they think his solution works? So the first thing is, some of them are compatibilists, some of them aren't. Probably most of them are, but the second part is they know Kant isn't, that Kant thinks that we have to be able to not be determined by conditions of sensibility. That means like all the stuff that we're experiencing and going on even in our bodies can't just make us do whatever happens next. And yet the idea that somehow you and I are empirical selves who stand within, which are phenomena and are in this world of appearances, which is totally determined by causality, that somehow we could be free because the noumenal aspect of us is free. And yet, even though everything else is determined, I think people generally think it doesn't work. Rightly so. I mean, even Kant struggled with how to make this work. I mean, from the time of the first edition of A Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 to its second edition in 1787-88, the critique of, and then the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, that's 1785's most important ethical treatise, then the critique of practical reason, 1788, where he works on his theory of freedom more, then the religion within the boundary of reason alone, 1792, and then the metaphysics of morals itself, 1797. He keeps changing. And the critique of judgments, of the power of judgment, 1790. He keeps struggling with this issue of how, on the one hand, and he thinks we have to accept the fact that on the one hand, there's this world of science, which is merely appearance, but which is deterministic. And on the other hand, we are moral beings. Being moral beings means we must have choice. Somehow we have to be able to think of ourselves as free. Maybe the solution is that somehow the noumenal us is free, and that somehow gives freedom to the empirical us down here. But how that could work, how that could be, it doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody thinks it does. What people try to do instead is, what time is it? Okay, we still have a minute. So what people try to do instead is they try to reduce the difference between things in themselves, or the noumena, and the phenomenal. So there are kind of two interpretations. One is the two-world view, and the other is the kind of one-world view. I think that the two-world view of a traditional interpretation is that Kant really thinks of the phenomenal world, and then there's noumenal stuff, and it's just different, and it doesn't work the same way, and so forth. So that somehow that being free could make us who are determined free too, and so forth. But other people want to say, no, the noumenal isn't really some other kind of thing. It's phenomena just when we abstract away what we add to it with our own consciousness. And so that there really isn't some different thing. And they just find in general the kind of two worlds thing to be spooky and weird. And and try and dispense with that. And then if they do that, then they give they're forced to give a more compatibilist reading of Kant on freedom, because the idea that there's some other us that is free because it's under totally different conditions and so forth doesn't make sense and so forth. But I think that the so-called two-world view is just straightforwardly the right interpretation. Yeah.
So he is incompatible.
Yeah.
And then that last part where you're talking about bracketing off the noumenal world, is that like Husserl and phenomenology and stuff? Is that what you're referring to there?
No. No, I'm talking about modern interpretations of Kant, stuff that like Henry Allison, for example, is the leading Kant scholars. Yeah. No, there's a whole nother issue of how to deal with the noumena and stuff. I mean, from the get-go, Kant's followers were uncomfortable. Some of them were uncomfortable with having these two things, the noumenal on the one hand and the phenomenal on the other, in part because if the noumenal is things in themselves and all we know is phenomena, it raises certain skeptical worries. Like, we don't know things in themselves. So where German idealism then subsequently went was the idea that, no, the phenomenal, that which our consciousness constructs or the world's consciousness constructs, is what's really real. And they try to bring the two together. But that's for another time. So, okay. Are we recording now? Yeah. Were we recording some of that? That's fine. No, we can keep it, actually. I don't, it's useful. All right. So, last time where we left off, we had discussed, there's a new handout, which has the outline for today and has the previous 2 days a little restructured just because I have to make it match better what the tapes are going to have on them and so forth, and we fell a little bit behind. So where we left off, though, was in discussing the fact that what the moral law actually is a categorical imperative. And we discussed what a categorical imperative is by contrast to a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative would be something that we are commanded to do, that we ought to do, should do, but only contingent upon some specific end or some specific circumstances. That is, I want to get into college, I must take the SATs. But I want to get into college and I'm in a different country where they don't honor the SATs or don't require them, then I don't need to take them. The circumstances change. But as we saw, morality for Kant being a priori had to be necessarily binding upon us and has to be universal. What's more, it also can't be merely done for ulterior motives, like some other specific end that we might have an inclination for. So all that rules out the possibility of morality itself being hypothetical imperatives. That would, among other things, mean that the person not seeking that end would be sort of exempt from the morality itself. And at the very end of today, I'm going to return to that issue in reflections upon it, because I'll have occasion to mention a little bit from Ayn Rand's essay, Causality versus Duty, which I think is an excellent discussion of the concept of duty and what's wrong with it. But the idea that morality must be absolute, and certain things related, there are certain elements of truth that make this which make Kant's theory appealing to many philosophers, to many just people in general, whether they know it's Kantianism or not. And we'll have to spell out exactly what's sort of right about thinking morality is absolute, and then what's wrong about it and how he conceives of absolute. Okay? But for now, we're going to talk about what specifically the categorical imperative orders us to do, what the imperative is. So the clue, as it were, to what this moral law that holds in all cases absolutely could possibly be, because what could be like that, is the very fact that it must be by its nature universal. That is, it applies to all rational beings all the time, and binding upon them. So whatever it is, It has to be the kind of thing that everybody has to do, that it makes sense that everybody is doing and always is doing all the time. That means, as a minimum condition, it has to be whatever morality tells us to do, it has to be the kind of thing that could be done in that way. That is universally in all cases. And so Kant tries to transition. There's a bit of subtle fallacy in the actual argument, but it's a very subtle argument, where he tries to transition from the kind of general properties that this moral law must have to what the actual content of this moral law must be. And what he gets is initially a formal description of the categorical imperative. What I mean by formal is that so Kant gives 3 different major formulations or statements of what the categorical imperative says. He thinks they're all the same categorical imperative, just seen from very different perspectives. And of course, scholars debate whether these different formulations really amount to the same imperative or different ones. But he thinks it's all the same thing. And the formal statement of it, the first formulation, is one that doesn't tell us the specific goals or ends of morality or the specific things it wants us to do. Rather, it gives us a kind of form or structure for the kinds of choices that we're going to make. So recall from the previous day's lecture that Kant thinks that when we choose our actions, we should analyze them in terms of both a subjective element, what we're feeling, which could be inclination or respect for the moral law instead, and a maxim, a rule that we give ourselves, which this particular action is an instance of. If I see a penny and it's not too dirty, I'll pick it up. Or, for example, I will obey the moral law when it suits my interests to do so. That would be a fundamental maxim and a fundamental and evil one, what he calls the law of self-love. That is, I'll only do morality if it suits what I want. Or it could be, your maxim could be, I will do what morality bids me to do, whether it suits my inclinations or not. And that would be a moral kind of maxim. So there are different levels of generality that our maxims could take. But any kind of rule or policy that we adopt and that informs our actions will count here. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is a kind of meta-maxim. It is a rule for the rules that we form. So it says, here are the kinds of policies to adopt. Here are the kinds of rules that you can have for your actions, and here are the ones you can't have. Given the kinds of rules you can and can't have, certain specific actions, certain specific duties will be deducible, or at least so he maintains. We'll see how those are supposed to fall out in a moment. Let's first get the formulation itself. So if you'll look at the handout with the different formulations, you'll see the first formula is the formula of universal law. The formula of universal law reads, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. That's pretty dense, so let's break it down, break it apart. First, act only in accordance with that maxim. So only act on the basis of a maxim that. So your maxims that you act on the basis of should only be such that. And now here are the qualifications. You can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Let's take the last part before the antecedent part. That it become a universal law would mean, here's this maxim, it's a rule for you. that it would become a universal law is that it would become the policy of everyone, universally, all rational beings or all agents. And that you can will it is a condition on what it's possible for us to will or not. A little bit more on the nuances of that we can will it in a moment. First, let's take an example. So suppose I wanted to endorse the maxim, I will tell the truth and not make false promises. Could I will that be the policy for everyone? I could say, yes, I could will it such that everyone would always try to be honest and not make false promises. You go, oh, but don't we all need, little white lies and so forth? No, we don't necessarily need them. And at any rate, I could certainly envision a world and endorse one where people were just honest with each other and didn't do that kind of thing. Okay? On the other hand, there might be certain things that I couldn't will to become a universal law for everyone. For example, I couldn't will it to be the case, Kant thinks, that that everyone follow the following rule. I will act for my own happiness and will not act on behalf of others unless it costs me nothing or I stand to gain by it. So no one could will that everyone universally accept that kind of egoistic maxim. Why not? Why couldn't each person just say, I'm going to look after myself here, I'm not going to help somebody else unless there's some value in it for me, and, they can do the same. Well, Kant makes this much clearer in the Metaphysics of Morals in 1797 than in the groundwork, but what he says is, look, and as we've pointed out, we all want to get what we want. We all want to see our ends fulfilled. That's just built into us. And there will inevitably be cases where we will be in such a situation that we might need someone to help us to see our ends realized. And in those moments, he thinks, you'd be lying to yourself if you said you didn't wish that they would help you. So, for example, if you can imagine yourself, sitting there drowning in a lake because you can't swim, and someone who can just walking by, could you really will it to be the case that everybody would be the kind of person who would just walk by and not take, any stranger who doesn't know you would just walk right by? No, you couldn't will that. Now, you can will that you'll be that person, that you're a selfish person. You could will that you'll be uncaring and so forth, but you would be a hypocrite. You would, in that moment, you just couldn't endorse the idea that they could just walk by because you so much want your ends to be realized. Now, all of these rules are supposed to these conditions are supposed to hold a priori. And there's a concern that what we can will and what we can't will reduces down to certain psychological facts about us, which are a posteriori, facts about how we are constituted in experience. However, and that may well be the case, that may be a valid internal objection of coherence for what Kant's doing methodologically. But he seems to think that it's quite generalizable across all rational agents, what we just couldn't will at all to be universal. Kant also, so what does this mean? This means that any maxim that you would form, that you just couldn't accept it, you couldn't wish it to be the case that everybody followed this all the time, is the kind of thing that can't be universalized. But morality is universal. So it can't be that to follow morality, you take on policies that just absolutely you couldn't accept to be universal. Your will has to be able to accept the moral law. That moral law has to be universal. So any rule that your will couldn't accept to be universal couldn't be the moral law. And that means that the kinds of maxims that you just couldn't wish everyone to adopt are maxims that you cannot act on the basis of. So suddenly those things are out. So no saying, I will never help someone unless it suits my inclinations at that moment. Because you couldn't will that. So that's having that maxim, having that policy is forbidden. And if that's the case, certain consequences will follow. Such as what? Such as, at some point or other, I must be willing to help others out of beneficence. Because I can't will that I could never do it. I can't will that everybody would just never do it. That maxim is forbidden, so it doesn't mean I always have to do it, but it means that at some point I have to do it. So a certain duty emerges out of that. The second version of the formula of universal law is called the formula of the law of nature. And here's how Kant puts it. So act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Now, a law of nature, as against a universal law in the first version of the first formula, presumably a moral law, a universal law of nature would be something that everyone deterministically did. So imagine that this maxim that you're considering, I will always pick up pennies unless they're too dirty, suddenly by your will became something that every human being just had to do. The way they have to breathe, the way their cells, they have no control over whether their cells metabolize. And the test is, but it's a law of nature, right? So it is just a kind of one of these causal rules. Now, the test here of the maxim is, could this thing even coherently, meaningfully become that kind of universal law of nature? Or would it literally lead to an incoherent state of affairs? For example, suppose you were to try to legislate to yourself, to accept for yourself, the maxim, I will always collect and attempt to acquire stamps, and I will never freely give them up to anyone. Now suppose all of us suddenly became stamp hoarders, okay? How would that work? Well, you wouldn't be able to buy stamps from the post office because there isn't a single postmaster who'd be willing to sell them to you. Not to mention the government that prints the stamps wouldn't actually, let it leave the warehouse. But everyone is obsessed with pursuing having stamps. So that means that actually all of us are going to have to start making our own stamps. Only we won't put them on letters because that would be dispensing with them. And so we'll all just make these little stamps and never give them to anyone, which means that we won't have time to do all our other jobs, and the whole system, the social system, with enough luxuries and technology such that we could even make stamps would collapse. And, you couldn't print your own stamps, much less, have complex agriculture if nobody farmed and nobody made shoes and nobody worked on the computer and nobody ran the banks, if everybody was just making stamps all day. In other words, it would just literally fall apart into incoherence. It just wouldn't make any sense. So that can't be the kind of maxim we can adopt, because it's the kind of thing that if everybody did it and had to do it, it wouldn't work at all. Now, it hardly needs to be the case in reality. In reality, it hardly needs to be the case that for something to be the right thing to do, it has to be something that it could very well work out that everybody was sort of forced to do, presumably. But on the other hand, there is this much sort of element of truth to what Kant's doing. Whatever morality ethics does tell us, it is universal for all beings with human nature. And it has to be the case, what's more, that one can do it in principle, act on principle. And thinking about acting on principle is in part thinking about something that everybody would do. So for example, if you're, say, an egoist, right, you want to act for your own sake, for your own life and happiness. But at the same time, if you're acting on principle and you're accepting morality on principle, you accept simultaneously that every other human being has that same end and that same prerogative to seek their own life and happiness, and is not to be considered, your personal tool, your slave. To be thinking about this morality would be to think it doesn't just apply to me, it applies to everybody. Or it also has to be the kind of thing that does apply in general. For example, independence, thinking for oneself, is not the kind of thing that you got to do on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, but not Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. What's significant about rationality as the core, as virtue, is that it's always the case that rationality is in your best interest. It's always for best policy. And similarly, the virtues that carry it out are always the right thing to do. Right thing in this case because they lead to your long-term survival and well-being, not because they're just moral laws given to us by pure practical reason, but nevertheless, they do hold in principle for all human beings and in general. So I think there might be many things that would be sensible for you to do and do as policies that were not universalizable in this sense, that depended on certain peculiarities of you. So for example, if you're diabetic, perhaps it's sensible for you to always take your blood sugar levels before any meals and periodically between meals. Now, that's something you probably should do. It's very good for you. But that's not something that ought to show up in a philosophical treatise on ethics, because that's not the kind of general principle that any human being needs to follow. It might be one that you do, but what holds about ethical principles are that these are the norms, the guidelines, the shoulds that apply to everybody and everybody all the time, and which is another way of saying in all aspects of their life or in the most general ways. So I think it's relevant to notice that there are real properties, if you will, about morality that this is mistakenly picking up on. It's part of what gives Kantianism its cachet in comparison to other moral philosophies like utilitarianism, where, well, whatever would maximize the greatest pleasure for the greatest number will work. And that might mean that for you, that means doing one thing, and for her, another policy altogether, and for him, a different policy, and one today and a different one tomorrow. Evan?
Was Kant explicitly contrasting his theory with utilitarianism? Because I thought utilitarianism wasn't formulated until
Correct. Right. So no, Kant was not reacting to utilitarianism. That came after. John Stuart Mill is reacting in some way, and in some ways being influenced by Kant. The biggest difference being that, or one of the biggest differences being that utilitarianism puts no stock in your motives for actions. So it doesn't matter why you did it. If it benefits the greatest number, that's good. You could have totally sort of corrupt reasons, and it would still say that's good. Whereas the action might not work out in anybody's benefit for Kant, but if it's done because it's the moral law, out of respect for the moral law, it's good, regardless of the consequences. But what Kant is reacting to is different versions of what we call Eudaimonism, the view that one should seek one's own happiness, that we're in the air, in the Enlightenment, and he explicitly criticizes these views. He says, if Eudaimonism is adopted in favor over, and then he gives his own theory's name, it will be, if Eudaimonism is adopted, ... it will be the euthanasia of morals. And he thinks it deprives, because it would make morality just conditional on satisfying these certain particular ends. It would lose its absolute status. It would lose its sublimity, he thinks, and its majesty and its authority. You could think of it this way, if you want to kind of have some sense of what's going on in his head. It would be like saying all of a sudden, if I suddenly put don't murder in the exact same category as don't eat too many carbs. What? Some dietary recommendation? If I want to lose weight and I happen to have this kind of constitution, and now that's whether I can lie or not, whether I can kill myself or not, that's all that it ends up being. That's unacceptable. That would be what would happen if morality was no more than hypothetical imperatives. Okay. Now, as I said a moment ago, by testing our maxims and deciding which maxims we can hold and which ones we can't, or which ones we can will our actions through, we create corresponding duties, corresponding obligations for certain kinds of actions, or from restraint from certain kinds of actions. And there are two classes of duties, according to Kant: perfect duties and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are what he calls negative and narrow. Imperfect duties are positive and wide. Let's talk about perfect duties first. That they're perfect means that they are being followed at all times, in all cases. That they're negative means that they say what you can't do. They proscribe, they ban. As such, then, they become those things which you may never do. And thus you have a duty not to do these certain things. They're narrow because there's no leeway about them. There's no discretion about sometimes, not always. It's binary. Either you can or you can't. You can't. Not sometimes, not always. His two major examples of perfect duties, which are negative and narrow, are the bans on suicide and on lying or promise breaking, making false promises, I should say. For false promise breaking, or for false promise breaking, that it'd be good to break false promises. For promise breaking or lying, consider the formula of the law of nature. Kant thinks, look, if you were to will the maxim, I will make promises falsely with no intent to carry them out whenever it suits me, or I will renege on my promises whenever it suits my inclination, then you were to consider that to become a law of nature, then basically everyone would be the kind of person who would lie whenever it seemed to suit their interests. And remember, we're not talking about what we might call our rational long-term interests, we're talking about any of the kinds of things you might have inclinations for. So it's the idea that on a whim you could break any promise, and a person will break a promise on a whim. Well, what if everyone did that? If everyone did that, Kant thinks, then no one would tell promises anymore. They would be worthless. If all you need is some slight disinclination to carry out your promise or your contract, or you just had some slight reason for not wanting to tell the truth to someone, nobody would ever tell the truth. Everyone would always be breaking their promises. It would be, you'd promise to deliver, someone, certain payment for goods or services rendered, and you think, it's kind of a hassle. I'm not a thief, but I don't really want to pay it back. I know you might think I have to pay it back. The law makes you, but I don't want to. Okay, and then they don't. Well, if that was how everyone acted, forget contracts, right? Forget promises. Forget even expecting that anything that came out of somebody's mouth wasn't purely mendacious. Because anytime they felt like it, they would just dissimulate. For suicide, consider here the formula of the universal law. Could you will that it become a universal law? Well, suicide, when we kill ourselves, we take ourselves out of the game of life. And in life, we are under the command of pure practical reason. We are under the reign of and the legislation of the moral law. That's our duty. That's our moral responsibility. To say, I will kill myself if life becomes displeasant for me, is to say, I can opt out of serving morality whenever I want. I don't have to be here to do this anymore. But that would be to say that, morality just holds no authority for me. And clearly morality has to deny that it has no authority. Among other things, morality says, I'm authoritative. Don't take upon yourself policies that would just flaunt your disregard for my authority, like suicide. So, you can never commit suicide. You can never deliberately tell a falsehood, a lie, make false promises. That doesn't mean that you couldn't honestly enter into a kind of agreement with someone in good faith, with every effort to fulfill your obligation, and then, something might happen such that you couldn't do it. It's not saying never ever be in any kind of situation that you would ever have to go back on your word. It's never give your word fatuously, without the intention of fulfilling it, and without some sense that you have the means to fulfill it as well. Okay? Imperfect duties, now, by contrast, are positive and wide. To say that they're positive means they prescribe specific things that we have to do. They're not bans against doing things, they're things that we have to take upon ourselves to do. But that they're wide means there's latitude with regard to them. That is to say that it's a matter of discretion when, at what time, and to what degree, and in what manner we carry out these duties. Now you might say, wait a minute, this is sort of a sometimes, not always. How is this a categorical imperative? How does this come out of the categorical imperative? Well, remember the example of wherein we saw that you couldn't will as as a universal law the maxim of never helping others. Because at some point you could only will that someone else was going to help you out of that lake, say. Okay? Well, that means you can't will the maxim, I will never act for the happiness of others. What does that mean? That means I must accept that at some point, or I must accept, or I can't never act for other people's happiness. So whereas negative, so let's put these both in a universal form. The negative or perfect duties say never, not ever. Imperfect duties or positive duties say not never, or whenever, or at some point, in some degree. Now, some of the so-called material as against formal properties of morality, that is not just the way that we form these laws and the resultant laws, but also specific ends that we seek, so not just the kinds of maxims we act under, but what we act to get under those maxims, are set by imperfect duties. Now I want to forestall possible misunderstanding here. Kant calls these, in very late writings in the Metaphysics of Morals, the objects of these imperfect duties, ends that are also duties. Now, I want to reiterate, morality is not for the sake of anything else. And normally when we say there are certain ends of morality, we might mean there are certain goals which morality is to see you get. That is, for example, in objectivist ethics, morality is a code for living a human life. But this is not to say that Kantian ethics is a code for perfecting oneself or promoting the happiness of others. That is, that all the rules are set and conditioned so as to satisfy those. Rather, morality is done for its own sake, just for morality's sake, not for some end. But among other things, it does tell you to go after certain specific things for their own sake, or for morality's sake. And these would be promoting the happiness of others and perfecting oneself or one's talents and capacities. That means developing the abilities that you have, intellectual, physical, etc. Why can't you never do that? Well, two reasons. First of all, why can't you just never work on self-improvement, work on developing your abilities? Two reasons. One, we all set these ends and we all want to get what we want. And Kant thinks that when we will an end, when we say, hey, I want that, I set that as a value for myself, we also will the means to that end. That is to say, we might not know specifically how we're going to get it, but if I say, hey, I want, that's for me, that's my value, we're also saying, I'm going to do what it takes to get that value. Which means that I can't completely give up developing my means to obtain ends. My ability to obtain my ends depends on my capabilities, intellectual, physical, etc. So basically, by saying I never ever work on myself at all, you'd be saying I'm going to do nothing to ever be able to get the ends that I set for myself. And nobody could will that because everybody wants their ends and to some degree wills the means to their ends. But the second and more fundamental reason that no one can wholly neglect perfecting oneself and that we have a positive duty to it is that among other things, or first among all other things, the kind of perfection that Kant thinks we have a duty to seek in ourselves is moral perfection. Nobody can will that they never try to become good people, that they never try to obey morality, that they never try to become better and more dutiful and more respectful towards the law. In other words, among other things that morality requires is the effort to try to be moral and to work on that. So, at least in his very most late ethical thought, Kant doesn't see perfecting oneself merely as, though he does see it primarily as, working on one's own character. And so it's something analogous to what in objectivism would be the virtue of pride, or moral ambitiousness. And you could see how, if there's this moral code that you have to follow, and there are certain, then one thing that sort of any morality of principles would have to have in it is a commitment to following principles, a commitment to making ourselves committed to morality. Because it does, and of course it does take effort. Kant thinks it takes a great deal of effort to follow a moral law, to act out of respect, because there are all these things that we want. And sometimes not breaking a promise, not killing ourselves if we're sad, acting for the happiness of others, even when it's not to our benefit. These things are going to require that we give up on values. It's hard, and nobody wants to do it. We're pretty rotten. So we need to make an effort to follow morality. And why must we make that effort? Well, we know morality is obligatory. We know it's our duty and it's binding on us. So we better do something about trying to do it, trying to make ourselves the kinds of beings more likely to do it. Yeah, Evan?
But for Kantian, he wouldn't think of, I should do this because I want to be morally perfect and I'm proud of myself, because then that would be a goal other than morality, right? So there'd be almost an inner conflict between perfecting himself and being motivated to perfect himself. Would there not?
No, I mean, I was asked this same question by other Evan at the end of yesterday's class. So did you pick up on the recording? Okay. I actually think that the two really collapse into each other and end up being the same thing. So doing what morality says because it's morality, and wanting to become a more moral person, which would be someone who does what morality says because morality says it so, I think just would end up being the same thing. Now, Kant thinks you might, in the latter case, wanting to become this more moral person who does what morality says because it's what it says, you might be kind of fooling yourself. You might not really want to become that kind of person. You might merely want to seem to be that kind of person so that you receive moral accolades. You might want to be able to put on airs of being holier than thou with others. Okay. But in itself, a desire that, what would your desire be to perfect, what would properly speaking the motivation for trying to become more moral be if it wasn't purely futile? It would be respect for the moral law. You could have an inclination to become more dutiful for duty's sake, but then you'd say, but wait a minute, you're acknowledging that it's for duty's sake, not for the sake of any other end, so what would your inclination be, right? Unless it were spurious and you just wanted to appear that way. Now, why isn't there a duty to perfect others, imperfect or otherwise? You can't, exactly. You can't. You can't make other people choose to follow the moral law. You have to respect the fact, we'll see in just a moment, that they are free beings who have to face that choice themselves and treat them accordingly, which carries a lot along with it for Kant. But you can't do it. Why is there no duty to promote your own happiness? Don?
Because you're already inclined to do that, so it's sort of beside the point.
Yes, that's exactly right.
I stole that from you last time.
Oh yeah. Oh, I told you that last time. Okay. Yeah. So we already, Kant says in the Metaphysics of Morals, we already all seek to realize the ends that we have. There's no imperative, no command that pure practical reason, that this noumenal self issues to us to do that. We're already doing that. All that we have to do is sometimes restrain that when it conflicts with what morality tells us to do. The human condition is one of being sort of trapped between two competing forces, the stronger of which, for reasons that Kant thinks we can never fully know, but which we can observe, is that inclination seems to be the stronger of the two poles. That doesn't mean that we can't give it up and act from respect. We certainly have an obligation to do so, and we couldn't have an obligation to do so unless we could. And we know we could. We know that morality is within our power. We just cheat and tell ourselves we can't do it when we could. But it's an uphill battle. Interestingly enough, in the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals in 1785, Kant says, when you just explain really clearly what respect for the moral law is, doing what's right for its own sake because it's right, and you don't try to teach people children, to do the right thing because of some ulterior motive or some incentive. You just say, let the right thing be done, let justice be done though the heavens should fall, for example. It has this kind of incredible purity and magnificence to it that actually compels us even more strongly than inclination. And he gave up on that in a number of years, especially by the time of Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone in 1792. He was very influenced by Rousseau and Rousseau's pessimistic picture of human nature. I think he just saw how lousy people did with this ethical system and came to conclude that indeed, though we had the ability to act from respect for the moral law, few, if any, human beings, probably none, truly act purely from the proper moral motivation. All right. I want to briefly discuss in our time remaining, very briefly, the formula of humanity, the second formula of the universal law of a categorical imperative. I don't think there'll be time to discuss the kingdom of the realm of ends, though I have said something about, I believe in the first Kant course and maybe on the first day, something about why. Well, I'll try to sneak in 5b, but let's just talk about the formula of humanity. What is humanity? Humanity is our capacity to choose to accept the moral law or not. It is our power of choice. Now, initially Kant talks about the will as just one thing. It's this pure practical reason that gives us the moral law. But by being this noumenal thing, it also is what allows us to be free, as against determined just by our physical being and all its desires, which would make us unfree. Later, and I mentioned that he has to change this view because with regard to, say, autonomy, self-ruled, and heteronomy, ruled by other than oneself, because it ended up being the case that when you acted in obedience to the moral law, you were free, but when you acted against it, you were unfree. So how could you be held responsible for being bad? And eventually he makes this distinction between Wille, or the will, which is pure reason, pure practical reason, which issues the commands of the moral law from on high and has this kind of freedom, or is the source of our freedom, and Willkür, or choice, which is that part of us that sort of chooses to obey the moral law or not. That didn't solve the problem, but at least it made it less glaring, because suddenly there was this capacity to just choose. Suddenly choice meant choosing, not just when we choose the moral law, but choice meant choosing between the moral law or the law of self-love. That is, only obeying morality when it suits us, in general being guided just by our end. Humanity, then, corresponds, I suppose, more in the later writings to this choice as against the will itself. It's not quite that we're given the moral law, it's that we have this power to choose the moral law. But it also is the power to choose against the moral law. Now, a good will, and this is before he made the distinctions in will, a good will, that, acting out of respect for the moral law, was the thing that we saw was unconditionally valuable. The only thing totally good in and of itself, because it couldn't be bad. And you might think, well, the good will isn't what Kant calls humanity, it's what Kant calls personality, which is our capacity to obey the moral law and act from respect for the moral law. Because the formula of humanity says that we should treat humanity as an end in itself. And you might think, why isn't it personality? Why isn't it being moral that is an end in itself? Because it seems like that's what it has unconditional worth. But Kant thinks, no, in any of our interactions with ourselves or other people, we don't merely treat them as fellow human beings if they're moral human beings. There'd be precious few people we would treat with any dignity then. We have to treat all human beings as the kinds of beings who have free choice. The formula of humanity as an end in itself states, act so that you use humanity, your power of choice, as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as means. That means use your power of choice at yourself and another, not as a means to some end, but as an end in itself. If I treat you, a being with humanity, as an end in yourself, I respect the fact that you have freedom, free will. What does that imply? It means, for example, that I respect the fact that if you do evil, if you break a law, if you commit murder, say, you chose to do that. And I will hold you responsible for it and will punish you. So I respect the fact that you're a free being. It also means that as a free being, you're a being who sets his or her own ends. And I don't attempt to try to dictate or force you into your ends. It would be futile anyway. Now, so far that just seems like holding people morally responsible, but it's so much more than that. And here I want to distinguish between humanity as an end in itself, as Kant understands it, and the individual as an end in him or herself, as, say, Rand sometimes speaks of man as an end in himself. So Kant's claim is not that you individually, your empirical person, is an end in yourself. You should seek your own beinghood, and to maintain your own being, that's your ultimate goal. No, quite the contrary. Your capacity to follow the moral law, that part of your being, the specific part of you that is free, that's the end in itself. What does that mean? It means you're here to do your capacity to choose, including your capacity to choose to do what's right, is not here so that you can use it and abuse it for your own amusement. It's here to do what is right. What does that mean? It means, for example, Kant believes that all these formulations, the different formulations, generate the same duties. So, for example, treating yourself never as a means, but as an end, your humanity, means not saying, hey, I'm here for my own amusement, so if life starts to become not fun or unbearable, I can dispense with myself. No. Your humanity, that part of you, that capacity to follow the moral law, is an end in itself. It's not to be used just because you're happy as a means to keeping you here alive. Similarly, Kant thinks masturbation is morally reprehensible. You're treating yourself not as a rational being with dignity, a kind of being who can obey the moral law. You're treating your body like an amusement park ride. Like you had no higher vocation in the universe than a cheap thrill. And this extends to treating others as well. So anything that would involve objectification of another, where we see the person as a means to our end, would also be out. So if I admire that attractive person and, ogle them or something like that, I'm not thinking of them as a human being, this free being. I'm thinking of them as something for my own viewing pleasure. Actually, if I, outside of wedlock and the proper goal of perpetuating the human species, I were to engage in sexual congress, I would be using your body, and my own for that matter, merely as a means to satisfaction. And you in turn would be doing the same. And it wouldn't matter if it was mutually, voluntarily agreed objectification. We both want to be the instruments of each other's pleasure and satisfaction. We would still thereby become instruments, mere means rather than ends in ourselves. Now that's radically different from the idea that your whole self, your life and your happiness is an end in itself. In fact, this means that your happiness is by no means the proper end if it gets in the way of morality. It means you never think of yourself as just here to be satisfied. Voluntarily agreed upon mutual objectification is a good thing. You know the song, I Want You to Want Me? That's part of psychological visibility, and certainly in the sexual dimension. All right. We're running close to time, so let me make one or two last points of summation and reflection, and then take questions. So I want to reiterate something I'd been talking about in connection, and only put it in a slightly different way, in connection to, are you acting from inclination, are you acting from respect, and when do they conflict, when don't they conflict? I mentioned that the mere fact that you have an inclination for something doesn't thereby mean that it's immoral, or even non-moral that you do it, if it's not the inclination, but rather respect for a moral law that is decisive in doing it. And one way one could mistake what Kant means is to think that he thinks it's only when you sacrifice your own ends that you get any kind of moral credit. What he does think is that's the only time it'll be relatively clear, A, and B, if you do sacrifice your particular ends or incentives, you will deserve more moral credit than if you didn't have to. That shows just how much you respect the moral law, that you're willing to put aside your own happiness. But it's not that and following morality will mean making sacrifices to your happiness. There's no doubt about it. But it's not that morality says you've got to be unhappy. Why? Because then morality would care about your happiness, even in the negative sense. But morality has nothing to do with your personal interest, pro or con. Asceticism, the idea that we have to punish ourselves and deprive ourselves systematically, is just as bad as hedonism. It merely says seek pain rather than pleasure. But it still makes it all about us and our feeling. Whereas it has nothing to do with what we want or don't want. Morality will require sacrifice, and having an inclination, wanting to help your friend, doesn't mean you can't also act from respect. But Brand makes a good point in Causality versus Duty, which is that values do threaten virtue in a deontological theory. Every time you form a strong, lasting value, it becomes one more thing that could trip you up from doing your duty. It becomes one more thing that you would have to put aside in your motivation and act from this pure respect instead of. This is why, in a sense, the safest policy for being a dutiful Kantian is to, in effect, weaken one's own commitment to one's values, kind of bleach yourself of interest. Now, Kant thinks we can never do that, and it would be vain to try. But the Stoics, an earlier deontological theory, told us to do just that. They said, nature bids you have, say, children. You ought to do it because it's what nature would have you do. But it's being virtuous and doing what nature and reason want you to do that is good or bad. Anything else is not good or bad. Your child living or dying is not good or bad. Learn to have the state of mind where your child can die and you say that's not bad. It's not to be preferred, but it's not bad. Only all that's good and bad is if I'm virtuous or not. So the Stoics actually think you have to learn to really disassociate yourself from this. Kant looks at the Stoics and say they had beautiful respect for the moral law. They understood that morality was for its own sake, and they're to be praised for that. But their psychological picture of disassociating our ends is impossible, A. And B, their claim that once one had done this and become perfectly, say, respectful for the moral law, one would suddenly become blissfully happy, which the Stoics believe, is also a fantasy. One might have satisfaction with oneself. One might approve of oneself by doing one's duty. And he thinks, yeah, you'll feel some moral satisfaction, but that's not happiness. That's not getting what you want and being fulfilled. All right, well, I've talked about the last item already, about morality being an absolute. And so I'll stop here, and I want to thank you for so dutifully attending, and I hope you had some inclination for it as well as responsibility.